save that additional money that they would otherwise have to spend. Are there business groups that exist that are open to this idea? Do they need to be created? How do we get people to actually recognize this is a good idea from the business community?
Yeah, just a reminder, identify yourselves.
Oh, Dan Maurer.
And from?
I'm just an interested engineer.
Oh.
Well, there are a lot of businesses that do support carbon tax. Just as there were a lot of businesses that supported cap and trade. Now, some of those who supported cap and trade favor that as opposed to a carbon tax. Business in general has even an additional short-term incentive to support it, and that is that in the absence of a carbon-based tax or some other systemic policy to address climate, the EPA schedule of regulation will continue next year. The EPA has found greenhouse gases to be a health hazard. That gives them authority to regulate them under the Clean Air Act, upheld by the courts. So the trade-off, even in Waxman-Markey preempted EPA regulation of greenhouse gas. A carbon-based tax, in principle, would preempt EPA regulation. That's the alternative. We are going on a course, either quickly or not so quickly, to address this issue. We can do it very inefficiently through regulation. We can do it much more efficiently through a price mechanism. Thank you.
Excuse me, I think somebody else was up before.
No,
This is a comment. I think I'm
okay.
the only industry person
Right.
in the room. And
You are.
William Chicago, and I'm not speaking for Toyota. But just some perspective on it. Businesses do support it. One, long term, you need healthy economy, right, in order for people to buy goods and services. So there's a risk of climate damage creates a risk to a healthy economy and the ability of consumers to purchase goods and services. As long as the policy is stable and predictable, it's not inherently a problem. And so there are a lot of businesses, or a lot of organizations, World Business Council for Sustainable Development being one of them, that are on board with finding ways to respond in a socially responsible way to these environment and energy concerns, and continue to foster and provide the goods and services that communities and customers want. So I think they would be on board as long as it's a sensible implementation, not what happened with the BTU tax, which got all crusted up with all the other things that, all the special interests, right? Keep it simple and effective.
It started out.
Yeah, and so that's a warning. That's a warning, I think, for the carbon tax as well. That the idea, I think, has a lot of merit. We can assess the risks 20, 30, 40 years into the future. It creates a platform that everyone can move forward with, and if that's done properly, you're not going to have the opposition that I think a lot of people expect from the business community. They'll be on board, and it'll pull consumers in a way that aligns with a lot of the other regulations that are coming into place as well.
If I can quickly add just two things on this. One is there are certain industries that are going to be against it. Any sensibly designed carbon tax is going to hurt the coal industry. But that's a pretty small slice of the industry. And it's not that hard to take care of sort of the communities that are going to be affected by that. But it is, there are going to be losers. But it's not that big a slice of industry that's really to do a well-structured tax. The other thing is one key piece of this that's going to be important for business support is doing something about other countries that are producing things that don't have any kind of carbon regulation yet. So something like a border tax adjustment, or it's probably the best way to deal with it. Potentially some sort of way of compensating some of the export-exposed, trade-intensive industries, stuff like that. But that's going to be an important piece of sort of limiting the set of losers here.
So there's one other important point that why we would support this versus some of the other stuff. And they brought up other regulations. The problem with prescriptive regulations, say like cafe, is that there's no buffer in terms of dealing with the consumer response. The carbon tax buffers that. You can push or pull consumers in a general direction, but you're not locked into the exact specifics of how they respond. And so it's a much more cleaner, elegant way to hit to your long-term target. Consumers may on average want to get to that 55 miles per gallon. Exactly when they get there and how they get there may be a little bit different than what a prescriptive policy like CAFE does. So it's a simpler, lower risk way to get the objective and outcome that I think from a policy perspective, some of the prescriptive mandates and targets.
Go ahead.
Alexander from Carnegie Foundation. Firstly, a comment, just anecdotal evidence from Germany. It's interesting if you look at energy prices for electricity at 3 times as high, but people still spend exactly the same amount on average for electricity as the US because, I mean, they have a limited budget, so they're going to cut there because it's flexible and they're going to save there and choose more efficient solutions. And I've got 2 questions. The first one, you talked a little bit about it right now. Where in the production chain would you tax it? So what's the technical question? And secondly, this is a way to stop wasteful consumption. At the same time, in the US, you still encourage wasteful consumption by having fossil fuel subsidies. So shouldn't we at the same time also talk about these?
So on the first question, you could do this a range of different ways, and at least, ignoring long-term contracts and stuff like that, the effects are going to be fairly similar. That if you put the tax in right near where the fuels are consumed, that's going to affect how much people are willing to pay to buy those fuels, so it sort of gets passed back up the chain. If you put it much closer to the beginning of the production chain, that pushes up the prices of things that then percolate forward. The standard prescription that economists have for this is to implement the tax at the place in the production chain where it's easiest to implement. And that basically means the fewest agents or the fewest number of firms you have to deal with. So that probably means for coal, probably at the electric utilities or at the mine, that's about the same. For natural gas, probably at the pipeline. And for something like oil, probably at the refinery. But basically fairly high up in the production chain, because that's the easiest place to cover everything. If you want to go to something that's not just carbon, but is hitting other greenhouse gases, it becomes a lot more difficult. And that's something you really need to do at the level where the things are being emitted. But for fossil fuels, you tax the fuels, you're pretty much getting the whole economy. So there's a lot of advantages doing it that way. On the, remind me what the second point was?
Fossil fuel subsidies.
Oh yes, those absolutely you would want to start by getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies. But fossil fuel subsidies in the U.S. are actually a lot less than people think they are. So they're really not very. There are various things that are labeled as fossil fuel subsidies that are really sort of broad provisions in the corporate tax code. But there's not much that is really a fossil subsidy. So you'd want to get rid of those, but there's not that much there to get rid of.
Right. The most likely way to address those kinds of subsidies is not in the context of a tax shift and a carbon-based tax, but rather in the context of corporate tax reform, which is another area of inefficiency.
Other question? How ready is the American society to receive this tax? Who are you? Jason is I believe your office, the American Public University.
I think that as a general proposition, the public, for any public, not just American public, we're not different from European, the public in Europe, all these issues is you require good times, economic times. People are much more willing to accept, and in this case, the uncertainty of whether the tax shift would actually leave them whole, which is a real public uncertainty and a real political uncertainty, in addition, given the process, and if you doubt that, just watch the fiscal cliff negotiations. So people have to feel economically secure, and as if they have a some cushion, some economic wiggle room. This is the kind of thing that we would have, in the Clinton administration, would have been much more likely to achieve with respect to this issue in 97 or 98 than in 93. When people still felt we were in a recession, we weren't like how we felt. And consequently, I don't think you could possibly do it today. I think we need to restore much stronger growth and probably begin to see incomes rise in a better fashion than they did in the last expansion, to create a political context where people would accept it, unless you had a public perception of serious short-term costs associated with not addressing it. I wouldn't have thought this, except, the common wisdom, popular wisdom now, is Sandy is about climate change. Now, scientists are not prepared to say anything like that, but the public perception of extreme weather events does seem to be shifting the view of climate.
Now, we just have maybe about 2 or 3 more minutes. Another question? Yes, go ahead.
Just-
And identify yourself.
James Hanley with the Carbon Tax Center. And obviously we're supporters. I guess I would like to talk about the timing. I think that when we're talking about a payroll tax shift against, for example, the expiring payroll tax holiday, which is going to hit January 1st, and there's very widespread agreement among economists and politicians that that's a big break on the economy. It's a 1/3 increase in the employer part of the payroll tax. So that's going to create a disincentive to work and for employees to spend money because they're going to have less in their paycheck. It seems to me there's really an opportunity, as Rob Williams was saying, to shift from a payroll tax to a carbon tax by funding that payroll tax holiday that's going to expire January 1st. And it turns out the revenue numbers line up pretty nicely. We don't think that a small carbon tax starting at that would stay at that rate would do very much for the climate, but starting at that rate and ramping up over time, it seems to me we really do have a political and economic opportunity in the next few months to address a macroeconomic problem, which is this dampening effect that raising wage taxes would have, and we could use the carbon tax to fund that, and the macroeconomic benefits are now you're doing something more stimulative with the money than you could probably find any other way to do it. So
It certainly helps if you can make that link, but you have to make that link and make it credible.
Yeah. Rob, do you want to, this Rob, do you want to sum things up and?
I'd like to. And one problem, by the way, is that the 2% reduction is just on the employee side right now, so we don't get necessarily the substitution effect via the factor price, but we certainly can go in that direction with a more balanced payroll tax reduction in the longer run. It seems to me, as a moderator and an observer, that there are compelling arguments for the approach of this tax shift in terms of moderating the increasing evidence around the severity of climate change impacts and the efficiency of reducing what's essentially a distortionary tax. Economists use that term to mean that when we artificially impose a price via a tax on a certain factor, labor, capital, energy, materials, it distorts these relative prices. And by shifting away from that to an activity that we seek to discourage via what Rob described as the Pavlovian approach early on, we free the economy to flow in a more efficient and long-term growth enhancing way. So for my part and for the part of Get America Working, we'd like to basically say this is massively directionally correct. It is not the absolute finality in terms of the answer to each of the problems to which each of you have referred, but to be in this town, at this time, in this way, massively directionally correct, is a pretty damn good thing.
Thank you very, very much.